there are definitely many different kinds of meanings of the word nigger or niggas, depending on how it's being deployed by African Americans and by Black people now. I would say in the Western world. So, for instance, there's still the history of the word as being a word that's meant to demean, a word that's meant to injure, to cause hurt and pain. On the other hand, there's a use of the word largely in some aspects of rap and hip hop music in which the pronunciation niggas is meant to be an endearment. It's meant to be a way of, in particular, men saying to other men that you are one of my boys. We are rolling together. We are buddies. We are chums. But there's also within African American circles and Black circles a use of the term nigger that is used against each other to also demean, to say that I might be of a higher status than you, of a different class from you. And so there are at least three very distinct ways in which among Black people that word can be deployed and made use of. But overall, when it comes to people who are not Black making use of the word, the jury's still out on whether or not folks who are not Black can make use of the word. But because of the proliferation of rap music and the fact that so many young white people listen to rap music, many young white people have also started making use of the word as a form of endearment among themselves and their friends. Well, I mean, there's a very long history of sexual tensions between both white men and Black men in relationship to Black men with white women and white men with Black women. And so in that context, I suspect that what you see being played out there, even if the parties are not aware of it or conscious of it, is that tension. So here's a Black man who sees himself being of a certain status, and he's trying to figure out, well, why can't I have her? Why is she going for him? So both of them come in for a certain kind of verbal abuse in that context, right? The white man is dismissed as a nigger because in a sense he's being told he's a nigger lover. And the Black woman will be disparaged for being with that white man and in some sense not being true to herself. If she could only see the light, she would have made the right choice, which would have been to go with the Black man, and therefore he wouldn't have had to disparage, assert his status by dismissing this other man as a. Well, I mean, part of what we're talking about here is the effects of a celebrity culture, and a culture where celebrities, especially people who are largely in the public eye and who are in many different spaces and places revered for being good at basketball, for being good at being an actor or a singer or what have you, have come to the conclusion that they're entitled to have access to what they want when they want it at any point in time. And so in some senses, we see that being played out in the exchange, that there's a sense in which people are not only entitled, but they believe they can buy whatever it is that they want. And so when those things mix and people come to the realization that they're not always going to get what they want, it's kind of a small leap to see how things can become flared and can end up in violent situations. It's not a big leap at all. I think that if you talk to your average African American and you ask them about Canada and Toronto, they will know very little. They will have very little understanding of the nature and the context of the multicultural nature of Toronto. And it's not to say that everything in Toronto is settled, but there's a way in which people live cultural difference and racial difference in Toronto, I would argue, very differently than in many, many major Western cities, especially in U.S. cities. Many of my colleagues who are African American, South Asian scholars, when they come to Canada and they come to Toronto, they're surprised at the ease in which people of different races, of different cultures come together and so forth. So I think part of the significance is that it probably was a shock to their sensibility, because I'm sure in particular this particular group, they would have been coming to Toronto on a fairly regular basis in terms of their games. But it probably was a shock to their sensibilities that there was such a bond between a white man and a Black woman in which, when challenged, that bond didn't break. he didn't abandon her or she didn't abandon him. And so I think that, the significance is in looking at the ways in which some African Americans, even African Americans with a particular kind of status, are still find it very difficult to understand those kinds of relationships, and therefore might react to them in contrary ways when they come up against such a bond. One of the ironies is that, all of the struggles of the civil rights and the Black Power era and so forth against stereotype, against the use of economics to blunt people's life possibilities and so forth, we now see in certain moments of African American history being used otherwise. We see it in relationship to some of the NBA players, and we definitely see it in rap and hip hop culture. And we know that there is a strong link between some of the baser elements in rap and hip hop culture and some of what passes for a hard black masculinity in the NBA. And many black feminists have been writing about this now for the last 15 or 20 years, the ways in which this kind of black masculinity has come to violence against women, misogyny, the kind of language that's used to describe black women as bitches and hoes, and that kind of language has become now a mainstay of how many black men are thinking about themselves and thinking about how they're going to relate to the rest of the world. Well, I mean, the NBA, not unlike many of the large record companies who produce some of the worst kinds of rap music that degrades women, and I think just generally degrades black people, including the men who are singing the music themselves, are faced with a very interesting problem, because what you have is you have an NBA which is more than 90% on the court black men, and then you have a front office that is racially very, very different. And so in a sense, what you're seeing are a certain kind of clash of cultures. What exists on the court and the people who are playing the game seem to bring to the court and to the game a different culture than what the front office has. But what they bring to the court and to the game is what the front office has to sell, and they know that it sells really, really well. So there's a way in which one might argue that to a certain extent, the front office of the NBA looks the other way. They look the other way because to police their players might mean a drop in where it matters most ultimately for the shareholders' profits. So it's a very interesting, I think it's a very interesting balance between having the people on the court continue to produce this myth of African American men as being hard and tough and violent, and at the same time keep those profits up because those guys put people in the seats where it matters. 2 generations ago, it was guys and dolls. Now we don't use that language. There's a reason why we don't use that language. We don't use that language because guys and dolls in particular demeaned the dolls. We've come to recognize that that's not acceptable language. Now, if we're using language to disparage people, to hurt people by calling them bitches, hoes, and niggas, then we need to be able to say that that's no longer acceptable language, that that's not a way in which you build community, and that's not a language that allows you to value all of the members of your community, and it doesn't matter who's using that language. So it's not making a mountain out of a molehill, it's actually putting to rest. Unfortunately, the thing that so many of us are taught when we're kids, that sticks and stones will break our bones, but words will never harm us, but words actually do. And so over time, as we've become a more enlightened society, there have been many, many words and phrases that we have stopped making use of because we know that they hurt and injure. Ambitious, hoes, niggers, that kind of language does the same kind of thing in very particular contexts. I mean, I think that in terms of what the NBA might begin to do is that the NBA has to take a really different approach to how they understand the game of basketball and to the ways in which the kinds of money that are being thrown at young men who are 18, 19, 21, and 22, what kind of influence that can have on them and their lives. So it seems to me again, not to be over the top, but I think that the front office of the NBA really lacks a certain kind of responsibility in really fulfilling the larger context that I think these young men are being bought into. And I don't know how you do that, but in the great old days of rhythm and blues, Barry Gordy, who used to run Motown, used to send his singers out for etiquette lessons. Maybe the NBA needs to institute something like that for its players.